Hey viewers, Chris from Chris Country here with you. I'm really trying to make this video a little short today, or at least as short as I can. In this video, I would just like to go over things to check for, what exactly to look for anytime you have a vehicle that's showing a no-start condition. I'm really not going to go into diagnosis per se, only because I really don't have the proper tools to do all of the diagnosis on all of the components I'm going to go over. In some cases, I just really don't have the exact experience or know-how. First off, a real quick overview of what exactly happens when you start your car. I know you're thinking, Chris, you just turn the key, it starts. I know, I get that. But there's actually a couple of different steps that occur. First off, as anybody would know, is the battery provides power to the starter, not to mention all the other things that help start and run the engine. For example, the fuel pump, the ECM, PCM, the computers for the modern cars. It helps provide power to the distributor to send out spark to the spark plugs or the coil patch, coil bus. I forget what the distributor bus. I think. I could be wrong. But distributor and coil patch. Things of that nature. What happens when you initially turn your key over to crank is a signal goes down, leaves the part safety neutral switch, also known as the ignition switch in some vehicles. Sometimes the two components are separated, but most vehicles are actually consolidated and they're actually a part of a single assembly. But when you turn the key, there's a switch that essentially closes the circuit to the starter and enables the starter to run, which would actually start to crank the motor over. And from there, because the motor is actually turning, it will cause the distributor or the computer to see the engine turning, so it would send a signal to the coil patch to start setting spark out at the correct time. And also because the battery's been running the fuel pump, that the fuel pressure is causing the injectors to spray fuel into the cylinders based on the timing of the valves, so on and so forth. That all happens when you turn the key to crank, and as soon as the engine starts, of course, you let the key off crank. And by doing so, you're essentially reopening the starter circuit, which shuts off the starter so it's not running anymore. In a nutshell, that's how your vehicle starts. Now, one of the big things I'd like for you to take away from this vehicle, or from this video, excuse me, is anytime you have a no-start condition, there's actually two different types of no-start conditions, and both of these conditions have different causes, if you will. So specifying what the condition is will go a long way in enabling you to track down the problem, and it'll also enable the people that you're seeking help from to help you out even better. The two conditions are no crank, no start, and then crank, no start. No crank, no start obviously is where you're not getting the engine to crank over at all. You'll turn the key, sometimes you'll hear a click, a clunk, rapid series of clicks, sometimes nothing at all. And crank no start is obviously the engine's cranking, but nothing's happening. So first off, I will go over the no crank no start. No crank no starts are typically caused by, I think, pretty much three major categories or three major causes. The first major cause, and again, it's because it's the heart of the electrical system, which the engine definitely relies on to get it started, is the battery. The alternator could be tied into it too, because if the alternator is not working, it's not charging the battery, thus, dead battery, you're not going to start. But a weak or a battery with no charge would be one of your main causes. The second major cause would be, again, going back to the faulty ignition safety switch. That would be another cause to a no crank, no start. And the last one, and probably the most dreaded for anybody, is a mechanical condition inside of the engine which is not allowing it to turn. First off, battery. Again, I said I'm not really going to be able to go over how to check it. But just a couple of simple things you can do is just observe. When you turn, I'll show you real quick in my truck. My truck's running just fine, but I'm still going to show you what to look for. When you're in your vehicle and you turn your key on, you want to see, like, do all your warning lights come on? Does your buzzer click on? Do your interior lights work? You could also turn on your headlights and just walk out and see how your headlights are. Are they dim? Are they bright? Things like that. Now again, this is just kind of a redneck, roughneck idea, but if everything's working, if your lights are good and bright, then I would generally say your battery seems to be in good shape. But again, testing it always helps. You also want to check for corrosion, which is basically, you want to look at especially at your terminals on the top of your battery. You basically want to look at and see, like, is there any kind of like green, fuzzy, weird looking stuff hanging out around the terminals, that sort of thing. If that's the case, you want to pop off the terminals. You can clean it off with like maybe a little bit of sandpaper, just not too rough. But sandpaper, a wire brush cleaner, they make battery terminal cleaners now that you can find in auto parts stores, that kind of thing. Corrosion essentially adds resistance onto a circuit, and it doesn't take much resistance to deny the starter enough power to be able to operate. So you definitely want to look for corrosion either at the terminal or even in the cables themselves if you can, especially right before the terminals. And you just want to check your connections too. See, like, if the cables where they hook right to the terminals, or you want to make sure they're good and snug and tight. Things like that. Because if you have any of those two conditions, it's basically it'll cause your vehicle to act like the battery's got to recharge when really it's just either not good connections or corrosion. Things like that. Alright, moving away from the battery. Like I said, your next possible cause would be, in a no crank, no start, would be your ignition switch. Now, there's a couple of ways you can check for this, especially in newer vehicles. Like I said, there's a safety switch either in both manual cars and automatic cars, or cars with automatic transmissions, excuse me. In cars with manual transmissions, all the safety switch does really is you have to have your foot on the clutch when you go to start the car. Now, on automatic equipped vehicles, to start the car, you just either need to be in park or neutral. But sometimes, just because of the way the mechanicals are, for whatever reason, sometimes the park neutral safety switch won't be able to see that your car is in park. This could be because of worn out linkages, things like that. So one of the first things you could try and do when you're trying to start your vehicle is just put it in neutral and try and start the vehicle that way. Another way you can test, now this is again for automatics. Another way you can test this, and this will work in both vehicles, is the ignition switch nowadays is usually within about the proximity of your key cylinder. It's usually either right below it or somewhere over on the other side of the column. What you can do is while you're holding the key over the crank, you can try and like bump your steering wheel, slide it left and right, and just do that while you're holding the key over. Now, if your vehicle starts while you're doing this, what that would indicate is there's a connection problem with the wires, usually running either from the key cylinder down to the switch, or possibly just somewhere else, like maybe in the wiring going from the switch out to the engine. That would also help indicate that you have an ignition switch problem. Another way to tell if your ignition switch is the culprit is usually another thing that the ignition switch does is when you turn the key to crank, you probably won't be able to see it in the light here, but when you turn the key over to crank, like the radio is supposed to shut off, I think the headlights usually stay on. Some vehicles they stay on, some will stay off, things like that. But usually like your interior lights shut off and things like that. That's because the way it's set up is it's designed to basically free up any unnecessary circuits from running and thus draining power off the battery when you're trying to start the engine. So if you notice, like, you turn your key on and the radio is still playing even though you got the key over the crank, that sort of thing, then that would be another indication that possibly your ignition switch is starting to act up. I've been told a couple of times too that, like, if you just jiggle your key when you turn it over the crank, that'll help as well. Now, the last thing, and like I said, kind of the most dreaded thing to check for is the ability for the engine to rotate. Really, there's only about one way you can do this, especially in the no crank, no start. You're going to have to locate the crank pulley, which is usually the biggest pulley, and it's usually down toward the bottom of all the pulleys that the belt loops around. You're going to have to get a socket and hook on like either a breaker bar or possibly a ratchet, although I'd probably recommend a breaker bar. The first thing you want to do is see how your engine rotates. Now, most engines from inside the cab will rotate counterclockwise, although some engines rotate clockwise. So you want to make sure you know which way the engine is supposed to rotate. And like I said, hook a bolt onto your crank pulley and just try and rotate, and using the breaker bar, try and rotate the engine by hand by turning on the crank pulley. Now, it might help if you pull out a couple of spark plugs, that sort of thing. But essentially, if your engine cannot be rotated by hand, the starter can't rotate it. And if your engine's not turning by hand, unfortunately that means in the mechanics world, the engine is seized or locked up, which means it's time for an engine replacement, unfortunately. Alright, so that will wrap up my section on the no crank, no start. The crank no start can be caused essentially by one of three things: no fuel, no spark, or engine mechanical problem. But don't forget also that in one instance it could also be the battery, or it could indicate the battery. If you go to turn your engine on and you hear like at first it's like maybe for a brief second it's cranking normally, but then all of a sudden you hear like wow, 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 wow. Similar to that. Like if the cranking sound is slowing down, that means the battery is essentially running out of juice. What you could do is go ahead and jump start it, or have somebody come up and jump start it, use a jumper box, what have you. Sometimes this will work, but sometimes this comes from trying to start a car that can't start and the battery's just running itself out of power. But say like it's your first time starting it, like your first start of the day or whatever, like it was running fine and you just go to do that, then I would definitely say get the battery jump started, and you might even want to have your battery and the alternator checked. But, getting back to where I was. No spark, there's a couple of different tools you can use to check for a no spark, but basically you're going to have to pull off your spark plug wires one at a time, have a buddy start cranking the engine over, and there's a couple of ways you can test for spark. There's spark testers. I've heard of the screwdriver test, that sort of thing. I'm going to turn off my key here before I run my battery down. I've heard of people sticking the screwdriver up inside of the end of the spark plug cable, but usually I just hold the spark plug, the end of the cable, right above a metal surface, probably within a ½ inch or so. And then while your buddy's cranking it over, you're just looking to see if you can see a spark jumping from the metal surface and the cable. If you see a spark, using one of these methods, the spark tester is actually really good because it'll tell you not only do you see a spark, but if it's actually strong enough to ignite the gases inside of the chamber, that sort of thing. But if you're not getting spark, then that will definitely be the cause of your not starting issue. Now, what will cause no spark could be anything from a blown fuse that powers the electrical system. Could be a bad distributor, bad coil pads, some cases bad spark plugs, bad spark plug cables, but it's that general field that you want to go after. Now, the second cause of the crank no start issue is lack of fuel. You can do this for a couple of ways, really, or you can check for this a couple of ways. Usually what you want to do is sit in your car, either sit in the car itself, or just have a buddy hang out back by usually your fuel filler door. You turn the key on, but don't try and crank the engine. You just turn the key on. What you're listening for is usually a very faint whining or whirring sound, and it's usually brief. The fuel pump always comes on when you turn the key on, essentially to pressurize the fuel system, and it'll just kind of sound like a faint brrr, and that's it. Of course, I can't really imitate a fuel pump sound very well, but that's what you're listening for. If you don't hear it, then that would to me be a concern. The next step would be is you want to go underneath your hood. In fact, I'll show you if I can. It's kind of cold out today, so I'm not sure how well I'll be able to get my hood open. But usually, you want to go underneath the hood. I guess you'll get to see me open up my hood today. Ow. Fortunately, it wasn't that hard to open. And you want to come over to your under the hood fuse box. Well, you just grab the keycaps, pinch them, and it pops right off. Under the fuse box underneath the hood will almost always have a fuel pump relay. In fact, I don't know of any cars that are equipped with a fuel pump relay that don't have a relay underneath the fuse box. But anyway, you want to find the relay. And again, this is just a redneck test. I mean, it's really not diagnosing it or anything. But you want to have a buddy put his finger on the fuel pump relay, which mine's actually right over here. And you just have him turn the key on, and you're listening for like a click, or you have your hand on here to see if you can feel it clicking. Because the relay is basically closing the circuit and sending the signal back to the fuel pump to run. Now, if you're not feeling this, if you're not hearing the click, that sort of thing, that would be a cause for concern. But sometimes, even if you do hear it clicking, it could still indicate that you're not getting enough current to enable the fuel pump to run. But again, this is just kind of a jumping off point. The next thing you can do to help diagnose is a lot of fuel systems, well, not all of them, but a lot of them have a Schrager valve on the fuel rail. And you can probably see mine, if you can see through my breath, sticking up over there out of the top of the fuel rail, which is that brown cylinder looking thing. But there's usually, what you want to do is you want to get a fuel pressure tester, hook it onto that Schrager valve, which I'm looking at right now actually, and you just have somebody turn it on and just see what kind of fuel flow you're getting. You'll want to check your vehicle's service manual to find out what pressure you should see prior to engine startup. But that'll tell you if you're getting fuel. If you're getting fuel off the fuel rail, and you've already tested for spark, the other thing that could be causing it is you might have, say, like a bad fuel pressure regulator, or you could just have faulty injectors that aren't enabling the truck to run. So, and that's pretty much what I can tell you about basically the redneck check to the fuel system and how to check and see if it's the culprit for a no-start condition. The last thing that would cause an engine to not want to start is just basically mechanical condition. Those being, the engine could be out of time, either from a slipped or broken timing belt, timing chain. The critical thing I can tell you to that is if you suspect it, don't try and keep cranking the engine, because about 80% of engines I know are what's called interference motors. That being, if the engine's out of time, the valves project far enough into the cylinder that the piston could actually come up and collide with the valves and to bend them, break them, that sort of thing, and if that occurs, your engine's basically done. You're looking at minimum, a new head, and possibly you're looking at the need of new pistons. Another thing that could cause it is just engine damage, a crack in the block, combustion loss, either from something going on with the head, a warped head, that sort of thing. Now, if you have a compression loss or a compression leak, usually you're going to wind up having oil mixing in with your coolant fluid, because they both obviously they both circulate through the engine. And if you have a combustion leak, usually as a result of it, you have oil mixing with coolant. Now, things you can do is, like what I'll usually do is I'll just like pop off the oil cover here and just take a look at it. If there's like any sort of milky residue on it, it's kind of like light brown, creamy sort of, milky, I guess would be the right word for it. That would be a strong indicator that you're mixing coolant with oil, and that's not a good sign. At the very least, it definitely points to a combustion problem. And that could, after a while, just result in a no crank, no start, just due to simple loss of compression. So, I think that'll pretty much wrap it up. Another thing to do, especially like if you're looking at possible electrical issues, even under a no crank, no start, check your fuses. Check the ones underneath the your hood there, and it wouldn't hurt to also check the ones inside of the cab, because, or inside of the cabin for those with cars, because there's sometimes actually fuses in here that run things on the engine. Well, I hope this video was helpful to everybody, and hopefully you all were able to keep up with what I was talking about. But again, my main disclaimer is I'm not really going over diagnostics in this video. I'm just kind of looking at possibilities, things to check for, that kind of thing. But I cannot stress enough how important it is to do a proper diagnostic before replacing a part, that sort of thing. And also just remember the two main differences between crank no start and no crank no start. But I am Chris for Chris Country. You can always find me at my Facebook page, Chris Country. Or of course, feel free to rate, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I take good and bad comments. You know, feel free. I hope you all are having a wonderful day, night, week, weekend, whatever time it happens to be, wherever you may be at. Just stay safe and stay warm. Kind of cold out there, obviously, from all the snow. But I will see you guys on the next video. Remember, gang, keep those cars running. Mine runs straight. Catch you all next time.